Fred Smith, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really, really, really appreciate your time.
Pleasure, Roy.
Um, let's start with your first engagement with Afghanistan. How Afghanistan came into consciousness.
In 1996, I joined the Australian Foreign Affairs Department and was sent to work on a desk called the South Asia Desk, where I was responsible for reporting on three conflicts that we all judged to be intractable. One was in Sri Lanka, the other Kashmir, and the third was Afghanistan, of course. And that was the year that the Taliban first took over Kabul. Um, Little did I know that I'd be witnessing a second takeover 25 years later. On the first occasion, they were driving in Toyota Hiluxes. They say history never repeats, and it's true that the next time around they were in Ford Rangers. So I sort of tracked both of those collapses.
That is not your first encounter with Afghanistan, I understand. You actually went to Afghanistan
Oh, so I
before,
did know.
long,
You're
long
right.
before that.
You're
I know
right.
my stuff. I do a bit of research, you know
You
that.
read my books. That's right. It's
Yes.
true. It's true. My parents were um, traveled to visit my uncle in Pakistan, and they in 1975, and I was with them, and we got into a car, drove across the Khyber Pass, and stayed overnight in Kabul in um, in a hotel. And I remember, I was sort of standing on the balcony of this hotel and playing with a ball with my brother. And the ball went through the grill and down to the courtyard where 30 men were praying.
Yeah.
And and I said something completely inappropriate, like, "Hey, Mr. Exercise Man, could you throw the ball back?" And so that was at the beginning of my diplomacy in Afghanistan. Not an auspicious start.
Yeah, disrupting people praying.
Yeah, not good, not good.
No, not good. And just a bit of context, your father, Rick Smith, is one of the, is a distinguished uh, senior Australian civil servant and diplomat. So there is that link. You've had a very, I suppose, kind of say cultured upbringing. You've been all over the place as a kid, introduced to various cultures from Manila you know, to Israel, to
Yeah,
other parts of the
that's right.
world. Yeah.
Initially India, then Israel, Philippines, United States, and stints in boarding school in between.
Now, when just Afghanistan, Australia gets involved as part of the coalition to go to war and dislodge the Taliban. Uh, Australia takes responsibility for Uruzgan, and then there's a role advertised for you, which is I really found interesting. That there's a role advertised in the Australia's Foreign Office, and then you have a conversation with a friend of yours, with a colleague of yours, say, "What about this thing? I want to apply for it. What do you think?" And he says, "Yeah, you just go. It's going to be good to you, good to your music."
Yeah, well, look, it's the story is a little more complex than that insofar as, we were part of the initial coalition went in to Afghanistan in November, October of 2001, immediately after 9/11. We sent in special forces for that initial phase of pushing the Taliban out, and it was just our special forces roaming around the country doing what special forces do, for better and worse. But it was very effective, And then our special forces came out in November of 2002. And then, of course, in 2003, there was the Iraq War, and the Americans became heavily embroiled there, and we took our eyes off the ball in Afghanistan. And the Taliban began resurging, and with the Americans up to their armpits in Iraq, they called on NATO countries to send in contingents of troops, and each country took on a different province as part of a sensible enough international division of labour. And Australia was a bit late and a bit reluctant to get back in. And in the end, so many of our coalition partners were back in Afghanistan, and the Americans were eager for us to join. Alliance imperatives loom large in Australia as they do in NATO. And we decided to go back in, and the question became where. And someone said, "Why don't you go and help the Dutch in Uruzgan?" And the Dutch were the lead nation in Uruzgan province from 2006 onwards, and so we went and joined them there
The
and
Dutch were
worked closely.
swaddling in
And that's another
Uruzgan.
story altogether.
Gosh, I
So
read that bit. We'll talk about it. I read that bit on the train, and I just laughed out loud. I just so many people were looking at what the hell is going on with this guy. But
yes,
when you went for the role, there were a lot of soul searching I can sense from your own sense because you had your own doubts about the whole thing.
yeah, I did, and I was involved in protests against the Iraq intervention. I thought that that was a stupid idea. Um, in 2003, I mean, there are photographs of me playing music at a protest on the lawns of our Parliament House in 2003 against the Iraq intervention, and I was wearing this kind of stupid green hat because I was trying to keep a low profile. Um, it was kind of awkward for me because my dad was the Secretary of Defense at the time. But in any case, I wasn't convinced either way about the Afghanistan intervention. But as you said, I had an encounter with it with a good friend of mine who was working on the Afghanistan desk and posting in Afghanistan. He sensed that it would be a good thing for me to do as a diplomat, but also as a songwriter. And he was right about that. Yeah. And so I applied. Well, back to take another step back, 2008, 2009, the international community finally, probably too slow to realize this, but we finally came to the conclusion that if there were to be solutions to the problems in Afghanistan, they would be partially political. Early on, there was an inclination to solve it all with the military. And, we were very slow to get the civilian piece going. This was 7 or 8 years after the war had started. And so NATO countries, including the Dutch, I mean, the Dutch were way ahead of us on that. They had civilians, their Minbuza, their foreign ministry and diplomat and aid workers working there from 2006. But it was not until 2008, 2009 that the rest of the world caught on, and there was a sort of this civilian surge where they sent in aid workers and diplomats in large numbers to try and support the mission. By that stage, perhaps it was too late, but that's another story.
Yeah, and you go, of course you go to Afghanistan, you land in Kandahar, you hear about, your own there's a personal tragedy that you have to deal with as well.
Mm,
Um, and and I really felt, there's a sense of you're torn from multiple sides when you enter Afghanistan. You've got, your wife left behind. She's unfortunately had a miscarriage, and then you learn
mm.
about it. And there's a new world that you're trying to get your head around. And it is a place where, that you don't know where to turn. I really, reading The Dust of Uruzgan is such a fantastic, fantastic book. It's one of those books that you flick through the first page and you think, I can't put this down. It's such a fantastic read. It's the way it's written. There's so much fun in it. There's a lot of piss taking as well. You know, I suppose it's an Aussie thing to do, but it's just you being kind of pulled into in different directions about where you're going to be.
Yeah, well, it was intense, um, and they sort of sent me in the direction of southern Afghanistan without giving me a clear position in any hierarchy in the destination. A military established. We had 600, 800 soldiers in Uruzgan province, and it was not clear to anyone whether I would be working in Kandahar or Uruzgan. And I arrived. I went to Kandahar and had a look around, and it didn't look appealing. It smelled fecal, and and there weren't a lot going on. So I kept going to Uruzgan and stopped there. And when I arrived, the Dutch made me very welcome. Um, I think there's always a subtext for the Dutch, and for them it was that they realized that their own uh, the remit, the permission they had from their parliament to remain in the province was looking tenuous politically. It was contested in Holland, and there were six major parties in Dutch politics. Three were for the Uruzgan intervention, three were against, and it was on a knife edge as to whether they would remain there. So, my Dutch foreign ministry colleagues wanted to pass on to me their understanding, their comprehension of the tribal dynamics in the province, and welcomed me more eagerly than the Australian soldiers I was living and working with. Yeah, so it took me a while to find a place in the structure of things there, but cracking wise jokes and writing songs about Dutchmen doing unspeakable things in the Portaloo somehow endeared me to the
Yeah,
to the.
Uruzgan is one of those places where not many people go. It's not one of the provinces that people speak about. It's right in the middle of Afghanistan, so divided between, the Hazaras on which has become the Daikundi province now, and the Pashtuns veering towards south and east, bordering Kandahar and Helmand.
That's right.
It's also the birthplace of Mullah Omar, and
That's right. Yeah.
yeah. So, and there's a
So
lot of
it's an obscure province. I found
yeah.
out from my interpreters later that, when they were at school and there was a geography test and you wanted to get extra points at the end, the question would pop out, where is Uruzgan? It's one of 38 provinces, obviously, but a very small one. It's right in the Pashtun heart belt, except that it was Hazara province, of course, and fiercely contested around all that. 95% illiteracy. Women had no role in public life, primarily agricultural, very impoverished, and like a lot of parts of Afghanistan, fiercely contested land and competition for control of water resources. And those were what mattered to the tribal leaders I was talking to.
And dry, rugged, almost Martian in many parts.
Yeah, all of that lunar, yeah, yeah, indeed. I mean, there was a green area around the river, but apart from that, it looked a bit like the moon. And I was there in the summer, and it didn't rain for the first 3 or 4 months.
So picture your first week, getting to know, landing in that. Just give us a sense of the base, because it was a massive, military base that the
A
international
massive
coalition.
military base originally built by the Russians, in fact, and an old dirt, dusty Russian airstrip in the middle, and everything was around that. It's about the size of an airport, surrounded by what we call HESCO barriers, which is a kind of fortification, really, and guards on the base. And then, there were different camps within there, including an Australian Special Forces camp, US Special Forces camp, and then the main base, multinational base, was run by the Dutch, who had 2,000 soldiers there and ran a very organized ship in the way that Dutch people do. And then there was this sort of detachment of Australian infantry, probably about 600 or 700 soldiers, run by a lieutenant colonel, and the headquarters building. And I set up an office in that headquarters building, and also a second one in the Dutch provincial reconstruction team. I sort of moved between them and tried to make myself useful in that environment. And yeah, I mean, it was quite social in a funny kind of way. There was a recreation area with ping pong tables and barbecue, and people would gather there at night. And eventually, I started putting concerts on there with musicians from the Dutch and the Americans and Afghans and Australians on the base. And
But
you
it
get
took
two or
you a
three.
while. It took you a while to get to find your place, because I sense from the book that for quite a while you're trying to find and cement a role for yourself as to what that role actually meant, and but also trying to understand Afghanistan and the intricacies of Uruzgan.
Yeah, well, that's right. And I mean, I left the guitar under the bed for the first rotation of 2 months because I didn't want to be seen as a flaky musician. And got very engaged in what diplomats do in any context, which is talk to people and try to comprehend different perspectives. And in that sense, the Dutch were very helpful to me because they engaged very intensely with the tribal leaders, and they did a lot of research on the tribal dynamics in the province in the way that the Australians and the Americans probably were less thorough about. And they developed a theory on the politics of the province. They developed a theory that there was basically a rift between the Populzai Pashtuns who dominated Tarin Kowt, the provincial capital, and who had up to that point dominated the provincial government, and on the other hand, the Gilzai Baraksai Nurzai tribesmen who were fearful and loathing of the Populzai, with some good reason in history. And so the Dutch sought to balance, the tribal dynamics and how we worked in the province. And all of this was sort of news to the Australian team there that was very focused on the job of mentoring the 4th Brigade of the Afghan National Army. They were focused on a more technical role and less directly engaged in the non-military community there. So I took on a role. I found a role pretty quickly in engaging in the conversations that the Dutch invited me to with their tribal interlocutors and reporting on that and describing the politics of the province to people back in Australia so that we would understand the place we were working in.
What I also found in many ways interesting and also very, really, really, really admirable is the way you really immerse yourself into not just reading, Uruzgan, but also trying to understand Afghanistan as a whole. I could imagine myself, your lamp over your head and reading all the books that you could get about Afghanistan and trying to understand the history of the country.
Well,
Um,
that's right. Yeah, no, I mean, I was in a room with 8 soldiers, and fortunately I had the bottom bunk, uh, not the top, and so I had a reading lamp, and at night I would read, Rashid and all the authors I have in my book now, and try to understand how the Civil War came about and all those dynamics and all that complexity. And I read my way into Afghanistan at night. I mean, the literature is fantastic on that.
it's also very helpful. You reading a book and then getting up the next morning, seeing it playing out in front of you, all the
Mm.
complexities of the tribal intricacies. But, for me, and I think we've not really talked about it you know, in the West, which, the collective coalition. I mean, those who are involved in Afghanistan, I know. So we've not really spoken about or really understood. I do. I, I sense that I do, but a lot of people do not understand the intra-Pashtun dynamics and the real life impact that they have had on people's lives for decades and centuries. And from the outsider's point of view, oh, Afghanistan is a country, there are ethnic groups, see those ethnic groups as a homogenous whole themselves, but it couldn't be further from the truth. The Pashtuns are incredibly complicated people, and their, sub-tribal rivalries have real life impact on the way, the villages operate, the way the districts operate, the way the country was run eventually. So give us a sense of how did that play out in Oruzgan?
Exactly. I mean, as you said, Uruzgan was originally a Hazara province. I understand Uruzgan means, heartland of the Hazara, and at some point, I think in the 19th century, they were displaced, particularly in the south of the province, by Pashtuns, various sub-tribes of Pashtuns, notably the Populzai, the Gilzai, and the Baraksai, as I understand. Now, different valleys in Uruzgan province were dominated by different sub-tribes. The Populzai were very dominant in the provincial capital itself, Tarin Kowt, and then to the east there was the Mirabad Valley, which was dominated by Gilzai tribesmen. To the north was the Baluchi Valley, which was dominated by Baraksai tribesmen. And to the west, there was a sort of district called Dorawut. These are all river valleys, basically, coming from the Turncoat River. And to the west was dominated by the Nurzai. And of course, within that there were complexities and struggles over the ownership of water. But the point was that the water flowed downstream to the provincial capital of Turinkot. And so there was a contest between the Popolzai, who became very dominant in Uruzgan politics. You might recall at the time that President Karzai was a
Yeah.
Popolzai Pashtun, and when he became the president, he wanted a client who could run things for him in Uruzgan province. This is sort of how the politics works in Afghanistan, or did at the time. It's very much about sort of warlord, dominating figures and their clients,
Yeah.
and the relationship works that way. It's hard to describe to Westerners, I think, but basically he wanted his man in Uruzgan to run things, and when he was appointed, he appointed a Popolzai warlord named Jan Muhammad Khan to
JMK.
be JMK. So
All your
we even gave
acronyms.
everything ran on acronyms in Uruzgan
Yes.
province, and we even gave
JMK,
Afghans
MK. It's really
JMK.
confusing. You've got a
That's right, and
long pages of your, explaining the acronyms.
that's right. We spoke in acronyms, and you would call home and talk to your wife in acronyms, and she would have no idea what you were talking about. But anyway, JMK became the governor of Uruzgan between 2002 and 2006. And the American Special Forces loved working with him because he was aggressive and he hated the Taliban. Like most Afghan warlords, he simply was monopolistic and didn't tolerate any opposition. But of course, the effect of all this was that it alienated the Baraksai and Gilzai and Nuzai tribesmen. And by 2006, coalition forces working in Uruzgan could not travel into those valleys because the politics had been mismanaged in a sense, because they'd been captured. They'd had their attention and worldview attack, in a sense, captured by this figure, Jan Muhammad Khan, and by his nephew, Muhammad Matiullah Khan, MK,
Yes, MK.
who was even more cunning and capable of, these guys had militias of 2,000 or 3,000 men, and so they become useful allies on the ground, but there's a cost to affiliating yourself with those allies. And that is to say that in Afghanistan, when you make a friend, you also make an enemy, and it took us a while to really understand that, and I think the Dutch were more sensitive to that dynamic than the U.S. Special Forces who preceded them. So. And all of these things play out, in the way things happen. You in one sense, you have to work with the friendly neighborhood warlord, because if you don't, he'll make life very hard for you. But if you get too close to him, then you will alienate his enemies. So there was a constant, delicate dance there. And we tried to take a balanced approach to it all when we eventually took over the provincial reconstruction team in 2010.
But these people you're working with were not, your friends either. I mean, this MK, Matiullah Khan, he and his militias, unless he was paid, he would cooperate with the Taliban. It's as if, you're at the service of anyone who pays you well.
Yeah, no, he was his own man and wielded power. I mean, once every 2 or 3 months, we had to do a thing called a shoujo, or a logistics run down to Kandahar, drive down there, and he basically dominated the road. This is how Afghan warlords work, and they dominate the roads, the resources that you need. And he sort of controlled that road and had an understanding, we think, with the Taliban, such that if people traveled down that road without paying him off, then he would let the Taliban attack. And if you didn't pay him off, it would make your day-to-day business very difficult. So no, the alliances that are in play and are influential in Afghanistan are very complex and difficult for an outsider to negotiate, I think.
Yeah, but you guys were trying really hard to make it work. You can see the efforts that were being put to improve security, to improve governance, to improve local infrastructures. Managing all the local, micro level tribal difficulties that you had to deal with. but how, disheartening it might have been for you to, to work with people knowing that what you're there for, they're not, they've got an entirely
Mm.
different objective.
No, that's right. And, you know, I think many Westerners and Western troops sort of went into Afghanistan imagining they were involved in some heroic contest between uh, democracy and a democratic elected government and a monolithic Taliban, and imagining that we were the protagonists in some heroic struggle on behalf of the Afghan people. But of course, when we arrive in a fiercely contested context like a province of Afghanistan, we see ourselves that way, but through the eyes of the local people there, we are a source of power and resources in their struggles against one another. And they will use us and message us according to what they want us to hear in order to gain advantage in this contest they are having with each other, which may or may not have anything to do with the Taliban. Probably more to do with control of water and land in the end. And so I think removing that, someone told me that working in Afghanistan is a matter of removing layers of blindfolds. And I tried to take as many blindfolds off as I could and help my government to do so. Um, but the complexities are there, and life is a fierce contest in Afghanistan. Uh, and that's the nature of life there. And that's hard for a Westerner to understand because we come from an environment where there's plenty of food and water.
Yeah.
And competition is mitigated by government and rule of law. But that's not what happens in Afghanistan. And if you don't understand that, you'll be exploited.
And now, where does you know, the you turn to music and it becomes a thing in the, in the base. You become a known entity, I suppose, to people there. And eventually there are people coming in, and musicians from outside are brought in to cooperate with you. Um, you know, sing at parties and events. Um, but every song that you've written in Afghanistan or on Afghanistan has a story behind it. You decided early on that you wanted to tell a story as well as doing some work on there. Um, you know, talk about the dust of Uruzgan, and the context to it, because it is such a powerful one.
Yeah, so two things happened when I first arrived. One was I attended a ramp ceremony, a funeral, basically, for a young soldier named Ben Renato from the state of Victoria here in Australia, who'd been killed by an IED strike up in the Baluchi Valley on the 18th of July 2009. And it was very striking for me. I'd never been to one of these ramp ceremonies before. I was brand new there. I didn't know whether the danger was real or not. It made it clear that it was very real. Um, but secondly, of course, I just noticed how dusty this province was. Fine dust that would get into your skin, into your shin muscles, and into the laptops, and this dust struck me as an important metaphor for the opaqueness of the environment, just how little we could really comprehend of it. But anyway, as I got working there in the MRTF in the Mentoring and Reconstruction Task Force headquarters, I learned more and more about what had happened to this young man, Ben Renato, on the day he was killed. And basically, uh, him and his mate, Paul, a young man called Paul Warren, had been in an overwatch position, with a machine gun, keeping an eye on a raid on a koala on a compound known to be making IEDs. And they were just sitting there static. And at some point, Paul sort of shuffled backwards a bit and triggered an IED, which was connected by detonation cord to a second IED, which Ben happened to be lying on, and this young man Ben was killed. Um, and then it became obvious to me that this guy Paul would be in a world of pain, not only because he'd had his leg blown off, but because he'd inadvertently triggered an IED which had killed his friend. And I thought, this is a guy who's got a lot to deal with. And so I ended up writing the song Dust of Uruzgan. I've been sort of writing it, sketching it out as I was working, but I was working 11 or 12 hours a day, in the headquarters there, and didn't have time. But then I got on board the Hercules Echo C-130 to come home to Australia, well, Dubai, the hotel in Dubai, and I just started writing in my notebook, and I kept writing and writing and writing. And then by the time I got to the hotel in Dubai, which had clean sheets and a shower and bath towels, I just got my laptop up and wrote it all into a song. Yeah, wrote the song Dust of Uruzgan, which is probably the song I'm best known for here in Australia. And it describes a bad day at the office for two Australian soldiers, but also paints a broader picture of the province we were working in.
Um, as part of your no, I mean it is especially I've been watching it, listening to it quite a lot, and it's the one that you perform. It's on YouTube on your YouTube channel as well. The one that you perform, I think it's an Eid ceremony or something that you perform it with a group of Afghan musicians, which is
It
it's
was
such
Afghan New Year's in March
yes.
2010. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
such it's got some, you've done it on studio recording as well, but that thing has got a special feel to it. And I love it. I really do. But as part of your, eagerness to understand Afghanistan, you delve into understanding the role of women and the situation for them.
Well, I could only really do that by reading fiction. I mean, this is the great value, I think, of art, music, and literature is that you can't know what it's like to be somebody else, but empathy is an act of imagination, and that imagination can be triggered um, by literature. And I read a number of books about, from the point of view of Afghan women, one of them being Thousand Splendid Suns, which is one of the books that's currently propping up this laptop.
Yeah, Khalid
And
Hosseini's.
yeah, and that's right. I mean, because I'd never actually, in my entire 18 months in Uruzgan province, I never once spoke to a woman. It was not until I went to Kabul that I actually spoke to Afghan women, just because they were in the very conservative Pashtun South, they were excluded from public life. So I could only understand their perspective through art and literature. Um, and I think that's the value of music and literature in these contexts.
And there's an interesting conversation you have with somebody who talks about, it's good to have two wives because, they can fight, they can fight each other for you or something like that.
Yeah, that was the perspective of Matullah Khan, the warlord. Yeah,
Yeah.
um, I suspect it would be more trouble than it would be worth.
The thing that's really, interesting or in a sense painful, I suppose, when you look at it now, is you encountering Aisha Bibi, who features on the cover of the Times, the young woman whose ears and nose had been
Mm.
mutilated. So I found that really, really, I know, such an emotionally difficult moment that the role of women, you talk about the role of women, and then you encounter her because she'd been rescued in Uruzgan.
Yeah, that's right. We had a case we were working on to try and I can't remember what we were doing. We are trying to track down a family or something, and that's obviously just such a stark example of the way that that very instinctive conservatism about the role of young women in family life, and I guess the great sorrow of it is that it's reverted to that in Afghanistan now, and the Taliban have got their Ministry of Vice and Virtue and are perpetuating that. But one of the things that really strikes you about Afghan women is the depth of their appetite for education for their daughters. The appetite for learning. I mean, I've got a young daughter myself. She's 11, and I can't get her to do her homework at all. But there's no lack of motivation to study and learn, and that drive is there for Afghan women, and you can imagine just the extent to which they are now frustrated and thwarted in that.
And you wrote a song about the situation for women in Afghanistan.
Yeah, look, I did in the end, and it was called Thousand Splendid Suns, and I get it when I was performing it around the country, I'd have a woman sing it, yeah, I think I think it's an important part of the story that gets omitted very easily.
And Afghanistan becomes, Uruzgan becomes a kind of a home for you. You get back to Australia and then go back, and there's an episode where, you look at the mountains and they're still there, and you miss them, and there's an emotional bond that, maturing, I suppose, between you and Uruzgan, the country that you're not really sure, the province that you had not heard about before. So there's really there's a love affair brewing there.
It did get that way, I guess I just invested so much in trying to make things work there that the mind follows the body. And in any case, um, I found the Afghan tribal leaders I was talking to, for all their complex motivations, to be charming and fun, and courageous. This is the thing about Afghanistan. You can't avoid risk in life in Afghanistan, and people live with this kind of courage that I came to admire. And the interpreters had it, and these tribal leaders had it, and I got to know them well and to understand their worlds, and but also the physical environment. It was a very rocky, dusty lunar base, but the mountains were there, just sort of looking down on us, laughing at us in all our struggles. So I did develop a real affection for this funny little base, and eventually spent some time 40 kilometers north of the provincial capital, um, up the Baluchi Valley, in a smaller valley called the Chora Valley, which was just beautiful,
Hmm.
incredible quality of light in the mountains, and the green zone there. And so the physical beauty of the landscape, and the courage of the people, and their courtesy and their humor, eventually won me over, and I became, you know, quite bonded to the place. And indeed,
Also,
that's right. I went back in 2013, just as the mission was closing, just to see how it would finish, and did a series of interviews with the Afghan tribal leaders to get their perspectives and that sort of thing. And I was very sad as the base was packed up,
yeah,
because
and
there'd been this little village, you know what I mean? This little village,
yeah.
this little community had built, and suddenly we were just going. I felt I was melancholy. Sure.
Yes, and also, there's a strong sense of place, the tribal complexities of playing, but it's the sense of a strong sense of place when people were quite people complaining about the border between Helmand and Uruzgan not being protected because all these Taliban are coming from Helmand and attacking people in Uruzgan. So you can see the divide that existed and it still continue to exist. It's not us, it's the Helmandis. Or if you're the Nurzais, because the Nurzais are now in charge. Mullah Hibatullah is a
Mm.
Nurzai, and he's sidelined all other Zais in the Pashtun, at least southern Pashtuns, because the Eastern Pashtuns, the Ghilzais of the East, have their own power base in the Haqqanis. But all these are not really well understood from the Western point of view.
No, it's just a level of detail that we're not sensitized to unless we really explore into it. I mean, some of some Western intelligence officers understood all this stuff. Even the military intelligence officers made a point of trying to understand this stuff. But certainly, decision makers at higher levels could never comprehend this and how it plays out. Um, we tend to see things, we tend to like simplifications, but the simplifications simply don't apply. And yeah, no, that's right. It comes down to these tribal contests, even within the Taliban, as you say, between the Haqqanis and the Kandaharis, yeah, the
You
Nurzai and the Gilzai.
Yes, and as you eventually left Uruzgan, I found it very striking that when you first when you were going to Afghanistan, you were unsure about the whole thing. But when you're leaving, you arrived in Australia, and there's the sentences on your book. It says, "I got out of Afghanistan freer, happier, and I think a better person. The war has been good to me."
A funny way it was, you know. It really challenged me and and gave me, strengthened my muscles of empathy and gave me a clear sense that the problems that I thought were real back here in my life in Australia were not much compared to the struggles of these people in Afghanistan. And I think that helped me grow up a bit, for sure. Yeah, and and certainly, musically, it gave me a sense of, as an artist, it gave me a sense of purpose. From that period of 2013 through to 2020, I was very focused as an artist and a musician on telling the story of Australia's involvement in Afghanistan to the Australian population. Uh, we had a generation of Vietnam veterans who came back to Australia after the Vietnam War and were extremely alienated and misunderstood by the population. And I just thought that the Australian people need to understand what the soldiers have been doing over there, what the nature, 25,000 young Australians served in Uruzgan and in southern Afghanistan. And I just felt it was really important to understand their experiences, that the population understood that what they've been doing and trying to do and what we achieved and what we failed to do and what the frustrations were and the sorrow of it. But also, we had some fun at times too, just a complex and nuanced understanding of it all. And so I made that my mission in the 7 years after I got back in 2013 and built a stage show called Dust of Uruzgan, which I toured around Australia, and of course wrote the book called The Dust of Uruzgan and the album Dust of Uruzgan. There was a lot of dust there, you understand?
Mm.
And
Not that
there
Australia's
was
short of dust.
no, we've got a bit of our own, yeah, yeah. But anyway, it resonated with Australians and felt like an important job to do. Um, and including for the parents and partners of people who have been killed there, just to have the story told, and in some cases the stories of their sons told, was important to them.
Yeah,
And
and you spoke about the families of the fallen soldiers, but one of the questions that you kept getting asked about while you were still working in Afghanistan every time you went back to Australia was, are we making a difference? Right? And now we long past that. But I suppose the questions that you're going to be, you'll be dealing with, maybe yourself as well, is was it all worth it?
indeed, and that's a personal question for me because I committed a great chunk of my life to it, and I know a lot of soldiers ask that question too because they forfeited a large chunk of their working lives to it and lost friends. And when I got back in late 2013, early 2014, I felt it as if we had done a lot of positive work in Uruzgan. We'd put out 200 kilometers of road. We built 38 aid posts. We built schools, including the Malala Girls' School, which had 700 Afghan girls in it. At a national level, we increased the number of kids in school from 1 million to 9 million. We improved the health system such that life expectancy went from 44 in the Taliban years to 61. Um, and a lot of people in the cities prospered and found modern life and education and opportunity. Um, but a lot of people in the rural areas didn't, and they felt left out. And perhaps that was the divide in the end that sort of tipped things in the favor of the Taliban. I mean, many things went wrong in the mission, obviously. Um, and so by 2014, I kind of felt that we made a positive difference. But obviously, a lot of what we did achieve has since been eroded by the collapse of the republic and the takeover of the Taliban. And that's a hard reality for people like me and other Australian soldiers, and indeed, I'm sure British soldiers, American soldiers too. There's grieving to be done, you know.
I mean, has the grieving been done yet for you, or is it a continuous wound that you need
Oh,
to?
look, it's a continuous wound, you know. And I mean, and I went back to Kabul in 2020,
Yeah.
March 2020, and worked there through till the collapse of the Republic, and I worked from Kabul International Airport on Hamid Karzai International Airport on the evacuation, and I was down at I was at the northeast gate of the airport looking at those people on the other side of the razor wire trying to get through, and I just was horrified that we'd let it collapse in the way that we had. I mean, there were many, many reasons for it. There's no one person is to blame. You know, the messiness of 20 years of American policy on Afghanistan was part of the problem. The tribal rifts in Afghanistan are part of the problem. The way that people with power in Afghanistan used that power was part of the problem. Pakistan was part of the problem. I don't blame any one person, but it was horrifying to watch it all, the investment collapse. But of course, easier for me because I could get on a plane and go home. But for the Afghan people who had whose hopes had been raised by the international intervention, um, I know the grief is far more profound than mine.
I don't know, is that grief fueled by a sense of, I don't know if it's the right way of putting, is that grief coupled by guilt as well? I mean, do you feel that, or because you've already done what you've done, you shouldn't be feeling guilty about the whole project falling apart because you're one element of the project that you do your job well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm clear in my mind that I did what I could and what I thought was right at the time, and a lot of my judgments on a micro level were right, but it didn't matter because at the macro level, the the strategy of the mission um, was not being handled in a way that was going to work. Now, if I don't even, I don't know if there was a strategy that would have worked in Afghanistan. Uh, as you know, it's a complex society with rifts and problems that are not easy, that an outsider could not solve, and that people on the inside cannot solve either. So um, I don't have any illusions that I don't have a sense that I should have done anything differently. But there is a sort of guilt that we let it go so badly. I mean, the end of the last sort of 2 or 3 years was handled very badly by by American administrations. You'd have to say.
Yeah.
And this is the lesson of foreign interventions in Afghanistan. If you get the politics wrong, you'll pay a price. It'll backfire on you. And whether it's possible to get the politics right, given its complexity, I don't know. But certainly, the British mission in the 1840s got the politics wrong, and one man survived.
In Uruzgan, you had the music, but was your humor understood easily?
Yeah, I think so.
You
The
did get yourself
Dutch.
in some hot waters, though.
I got myself into trouble occasionally. Comedy is a fine line, and occasionally I stepped over it and got it wrong. But on the whole, you had this base with Afghans on it who are interpreters or working in cleaning and things like that. And then you had the Dutch, and then you had the Americans, and then you had the Australians, and they kind of kept to themselves. But then I would put on these concerts and parties, uh, dance, and you'd suddenly see these people getting together and sort of dancing around a room together and laughing at the same jokes. So it kind of it 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 kind of opened up the culture to more mutual understanding on the base, I think. So it served a useful function apart from being good fun.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, good fun. There were like, the two dicks, the hairdressers, the
yeah, let's not go into that.
yes, and then there's this thing again, which really, there's little things they I think, the way you've done the book is you go through a serious phase, paragraph by paragraph by paragraph, and then there's a last sentence, there's a killer. It just makes you burst out, laughing. It's just that bit where you talk about a serious matter. It's an intelligence report that your colleague tells you, oh, Mullah so and so is out to kill you. I said, how? He said, by an IED. So tell him to get a life. That
Exactly.
really.
Yeah. No, there was I thought I just did find it genuinely funny and sad at the same time. But I think also there was a sort of there's a sort of a perception that Afghan people had a very pious sensibility, but in fact, I found Afghan people very irreverent and funny. I think the Afghan men I knew have a very dark sense of humor and have to laugh at the world to get to survive.
But you brought them
Uh,
out. You brought them
yeah,
out.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So
Uh,
it's common ground, right?
yes, I'm a Hazara, and Australia's got a large, for a lot of Hazaras now, Australia is the second, probably one of the places outside Afghanistan with the largest population of Hazaras.
I think around 60,000,
Yeah,
and a lot of them came out in the early days of the Taliban regime.
yeah. So you didn't deal with them a lot in Afghanistan.
No, no, because they were concentrated up in the north in Daikundi, the north of Uruzgan province.
Yeah.
For all the reasons I described, they've been driven into an ever shrinking Hazarajat, which was in the middle of the country and in the north of Uruzgan, Daikundi. And so I didn't have much to do directly with Hazara, but I did work very closely with a young Hazara Australian who'd come out to Australia as a teenager, and
Sam?
Sam, yeah. Well, that's not his real name. His real name is
Yeah. I always tend to end my interviews on a kind of a positive note, but also something that would make people, so because you've been so funny, you've got so much comic in you, understand the complexities, taking the piss all the time, off yourself and off people. And I'm sure you've got plenty of laugh out loud moments that when you sit with your mates, that you first thing that comes to your mind that you want to make them, you know, burst into tears laughing. What was that? What is it that comes to your mind that you do?
well, probably the moment I enjoyed most. We used to have this banter with the Dutch. The Dutch have a very dry
Yes,
sense of
yeah,
humor.
yeah. Swaffling.
I wrote this song, "Nit Swaffling Up the Dixie," was ostensibly to try and prevent Dutch soldiers from doing unspeakable things in the Borderloo. And we played a final concert for them as they were withdrawing from the province. They withdrew in the middle of
But
2010.
before you do that, just give us a bit of context to that swaffling thing, because that's funny in itself.
Yeah, well, it was Dutch New Word of the Year in 2008, and it's apparently a practice of swinging one's penis backwards and forwards and bumping up against something. And it became a craze in Holland for a while there, and people in Holland would travel around the world swaffling national monuments and take photographs and send it back to Holland and things like that. And it became a YouTube phenomenon, you see. And I thought this was something we had to address and make sure it didn't happen on the base. And so I wrote this comic song, "Neat Swaffling Up the Dixie," which the Dutch seemed to
Before
appreciate.
doing that, you did something else as well. You did something more serious.
Oh yeah, what did I do?
You sent a cable all the way back
Oh
to
yeah.
Australia.
Oh yeah, yeah, that got me in trouble. Yeah, I sent a cable back to Australia warning the Australian Foreign Ministry of the risks of swaffling. I got a slap on the wrist for that. It was not a good idea. Sometimes my sense of humour got me in trouble, I've got to say. I wouldn't do that now.
Hmm.
Um, and we played this final concert, and I played the first five verses of this "Nit Swaffling Up the Dixie" song, which the Dutchmen seemed to enjoy. So um, they had just lost the World Cup soccer final to Spain.
Yes.
And so I just wrote this last song on the spot there, with the last verse, which went, um, "Well, Dutch friends, I've heard you're leaving. I know you've made this plan because swaffling's become illegal here in Uruzgan. But when you're back in Holland, you can swaffle what you like. You can swaffle in a windmill, you can swaffle in a dike. You can swaffle on a hash pipe, in Leiden Helene, but you can't swaffle the World Cup because the fucking thing's in Spain. And the whole area just burst into laugh and fell apart. It was just a very funny moment in the life of the mission as we all shared a joke because it's one thing that the Australians and the Dutch didn't always see eye to eye, but we had the same sense of humour, and it was just a nice moment of levity and amidst all the hardship.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. Really, really appreciate your time. So thank you so much.
No, really, thanks for taking the time to read the book and getting in touch.